I can sense that the audience has thinned. It has been a very long day. I have 21 minutes, which I'm going to take of your time. Thank you, Amina, for this fabulously organized conference. This session, in this particular session, I think my task is to try to set the discussion that we've been having in the broader context of larger developments in the era of globalization, and particularly the role of architecture, or the role that architecture may play in the 21st century. For this reason, I will not talk at all about Education City, nor will I even talk about the architecture of education, which is actually something that my colleagues in this session may do. Just figure this out. It is very tempting, of course, to see Education City and its architecture almost as the natural inheritor of a long tradition in the Arab Muslim world of building grand structures for educational purposes, particularly during the zenith of the Islamic Empire. In the 14th century, the Grand Madrasa of Sultan Hassan, which has already been shown to you earlier, with its four schools of thought represented in its four Iwans, may have actually captured this. This was during the Mamluk era, and in fact, it is a structure that absolutely dazzled the visitors to Cairo at the time, very much like how Education City may dazzle visitors today to Doha. Today, we live in an interconnected, globalizing world, but one which is still constituted of national societies, and the conditions of the identification of individual and collective selves have become very complex. Of course, any theory of globalization must recognize the distinctive cultural and unequal conditions under which the notion of the global is actually constructed. It has also become difficult to comprehend globalization without cataloging the historical specificity of so-called traditional societies. I would certainly put Qatar in this particular category, their colonization, their emergence as nation states, and their intense transformation in the global era. I am an urban historian, and my stock in trade is the study of the architecture of cities. Scholars in my field have argued that cities of the world, in this particular moment, are becoming increasingly homogenized. I will, however, suggest that in this era of globalization, where culture is becoming increasingly placeless, urbanism will still maintain some relevance because of its ability to explain the specificity of local culture. I will suggest that it will become an arena to observe how different forms of global domination are influenced, mediated, or even generated by locality. At the heart of this discussion is the question of identity. Of course, the connection between the identity of a people and their urbanism has been the subject of much research. Family, ethnicity, religion, language, and history have all been claimed as identity constituting elements that are handed down in a process normally referred to as tradition. Tradition is based on valuing constraint. And in a technological world of limitless choices, the conflicts between the so-called traditional and the modern become unavoidable. To cast the traditional as pure and the modern as corrupt, or vice versa, in my opinion, is very naive. We must recognize that no society ever called itself traditional until the modern actually came into existence. In studying the relationship between these two realms and its effect on the identity of people and their urbanism, I have introduced in some of my earlier books a few historical phases which I think are very important to take into account: the pre-industrial period, the colonial period, the era of independence and nation building, and the era of globalization. These phases seem to have been accompanied by four respective urban conditions: the indigenous vernacular, the hybrid, the modern, and the pseudo-modern included within it, as well as the postmodern, or whatever it is that exists today. Now, I have to clear this up a bit. Before colonialism, we had traditional communities. And again, I use the word tradition, having spent 25 years of my life having published 4 books that have tradition in the title, and in a sense I'm very careful about how I use it. We had traditional communities living in pre-industrial, often insular conditions. Although some form of economic exchange occurred between these two worlds, interaction with and curiosity about the other was somewhat limited. This was a stage where the form of settlements may have been an immediate reaction to the surrounding natural environments. And here I'm just showing you a few examples that many of you may have actually already seen. Whether it was Hyderabad, a city whose skyline was once shaped by its window scoops that all faced the very specific direction of the prevailing wind to be able to survive the very harsh regional climate, or the troglodyte sunken dwelling units in places as far as Tunisia, or this one, which comes to us from Loyang in China, where escape from that climate went underground. This is a very specific case where each of these pits is in fact almost the size of a tennis court, dug down to the ground about 30 feet, and basically all of the units, all of the residential spaces, if you will, existed around it. And in fact, it's very interesting, this actually comes from the famous book Architecture Without Architects, where the entrance happens to simply be the little spaces that you see in which, in fact, there is absolutely no mark except the tree that exists on top of the staircase. We encounter in these very specific environments, which were supposedly in sync with the immediate needs of the indigenous population, an interesting situation. These settlement forms appear to have been shaped more by the basic shelter concerns and the absence often of alternative material. They reflect, possibly at a subconscious level, a match between the identity of the inhabitants and their limited access to resources. Now, around the middle of the 19th century, the world witnessed the rise of modern industrial capitalism and the emergence of organized political dominance represented by colonialism. Under this colonial paradigm, the world became divided into two kinds of people and two types of societies. And I would still argue that even that division is very much on the minds of many people, including, in fact, people possibly in this part of the world. Powerful, administratively advanced, racially Caucasoid, nominally Christian, and principally European dominant nations, and, on the other hand, powerless, organizationally backward, traditionally rooted, and mainly non-white dominated societies. The paradigm shift from the traditional to the colonial created a relationship of unequal exchange, one that I think actually is beautifully captured here by this sketch that comes to us from the Illustrated London Times, a major newspaper in the 19th century, basically a master-servant relationship where the colonized subject is in fact basically offering service to the colonizer. So if we are to analyze the issues of identity in the cities of the developing world, including this part of the world, we must understand the process by which this identity was ignored, violated, distorted, or stereotyped throughout history. As a work of art, Jean-Léon Gérome's reception of the Siamese ambassador in Fontainebleau, for me, is a very good expression of this unequal relationship between the newly dominant and the newly dominated. In the 1850s, the Siamese were forced, Siam is the country which is today Thailand. The Siamese were forced to open their ports to European trade and to exchange ambassadors with France. When Jérôme was commissioned to document the ceremony, he chose to paint the single moment in which the Siamese envoys kneeled down to the representative of Western imperial might, in this case, in fact, the Queen. What is ironic, of course, is that the process of prostration that the Siamese engaged in is something that they would also engage in, if you will, to their king. But in this case, it was completely interpreted out of context. And the problem of representation here becomes very central because it is much of these artistic creations which have contributed to the making of the other and, in fact, to enlarging the gulf between the dominant and the dominated. Perhaps, and that's why I actually have as an inlet over there, Edward Said's use of this very famous image, also by Jean-Léon Gérôme, the snake charmer, on the cover of his book, Orientalism. Well, now that the backwardness of this assumed traditional population had been established, at least to the rest of the masses of the colonial homeland, it became legitimate to go about reforming it or civilizing it. Mission civilisatrice is the term that the French actually used. In some instances, the colonial regimes proceeded to sniff out the ethnicity of the colonized culture. When it failed to do so by force, it often resorted to the psychological techniques of hypnotizing the middle class, as demonstrated by the Goa House sculpture in New Delhi, which in this case represents the white settler subjugating the Buddha, a god in the local context. Obviously, all of this had an effect on the physical fabric of cities. Everywhere they went, the colonists introduced their own brand of settlements. I'm talking here about the overall planning model which determined the pattern of urban development in both the core and the periphery, the countries of the colonizers and the countries of the colonized, in fact, as this very specific illustration shows. This was the era in which Le Corbusier's very straightforward sketch would indicate when ideas would flow from Paris to Algiers and further to the rest of Africa, Black Africa, still owned by the French. The colonial era gave us a hybrid urban condition, and we see the architecture and an urban language that starts to emerge that, in fact, at least at the visual level, often unifies the land of colonial empires. This hybrid often borrowed from both the colonial homeland and the indigenous vernacular. The British bungalow, and I'm showing you an early example here, which actually comes from Calcutta, in India, a hybrid dwelling type, was no more Indian than British, just like the Dutch villa in Indonesia was no less Indonesian than Dutch, one may suggest. When the people of the dominated society started to rebel against the colonial world order, they had very little to cling to in their drive to establish their own sovereignty, other than using the terms of the existing order with all of its baggage of physical realities and even ideological constructs like the nation state. Groups of people living in one region under a colonial power, possibly only having one thing in common, which is a colonial history, but belonging to different religions, speaking different languages, different ethnicities, and different traditions, had to band together to achieve this supposedly more advanced stage of independence. The new commonalities were highlighted by the political bodies and by the political parties, while the differences were suppressed in pursuit of the goal of freedom and independence. A national identity based on short-term political interest and the ideology of struggle emerged as the driving force behind most nationalistic movements of the 1950s all the way to the end of the 60s. Once independence was achieved, however, the glue that bound together these various groups was no longer as pervasive. Indeed, the events of the late 80s and, in fact, the early 90s in places like the former Soviet Union, the former Yugoslavia, and even today, Iraq and Syria, are a testament to the true associations of these people where ethnicity, race, or religion emerged as the prime definer of their collective identity. Now, architecturally speaking, this second phase of independence and nationalism did not bring about immediate or improvement, if you will, to the conditions. During the era of colonialism, important and irreversible decisions that affect the production of the built environment had already taken place, and many of them had already been institutionalized. In the Arab Middle East, for example, new building codes based on Western norms requiring setbacks forced much of the traditional courtyard houses, in places even like some of the Gulf countries, were literally forced out of existence. Instead, we saw, in fact, the replacement with banal single-family dwelling unit following a particular American model that was not suitable either from a climatic point of view or even from a social point of view. But because of a host of cultural complexities, the modern type was still often preferred by the inhabitants, even if it required strange adaptation and often was not necessarily very comfortable. But even before independence was achieved, there were those who actually understood the importance of an emerging identity in architecture and urbanism. Some architects and planners in the developing world provided some lip service rejection of the modernist model and of the idea of direct copying from the Western world or from the colonial legacy. But while calling for a new, authentic, again in quotes, regionalism, they simply ignored that the Western model will continue to shape their cities through inherited institutions and regulations. The more radical elements of this group, architects, for example, like Hassan Fathi in Egypt, called for a total rejection of anything that comes from the first world and embarked on an architectural course that was primarily based on an imagined history and an invented tradition. National identity as perceived by governments is inherently tied to the image that the government wishes to project to the international arena. And I think this is a very important statement in the context of Qatar today. In Emmanuel Wallerstein's view, the state, through its monopoly of policies and resources, can over time create a national culture, even if it lacked one in the first place? Can one design national identity? Can this national identity be designed by a foreign power or a foreign architect? This is, of course, a question that often faced many politicians who governed newly independent states. And architecturally speaking, it was also faced by architects and planners who worked for them. And I would not necessarily take exception to the architects that we heard today. And you can actually see quite a lot of examples of that around the world. The Danish architect, for example, Jorn Utzon, who claimed that his parliament building of Kuwait, made of concrete shell, evoked a traditional Bedouin tent in its roof, while its plan was based on the Islamic bazaar. One may ask if the introduction of a building, even if it possessed the right cultural significance and symbolism, can create an institution like parliamentary democracy. Lou Khan's famous assembly in Dhaka, a work of high drama, engages in a similar exercise. Some have argued that its form may have been appropriate, more appropriate, for another country, with closer links to the Roman classicist architecture tradition that may have inspired it. And it's very interesting because, as you probably know, this was a building that was actually commissioned to be the headquarters of the state of Pakistan in the state of East Pakistan, which is part of Pakistan. But by the time the building was actually complete, Bangladesh was an independent state and it needed a building to occupy, so that became its parliament, if you will. Yet, this building, with its entire complexity of forms and materials that actually come from elsewhere, has still become a very strong symbol of Bangladesh. You see it on the money, you see it as the thing that people put on the bumper stickers of cabs, so on and so forth. The point that I'm making here is, when does a building become representative of its own culture? One may ask, at what point did the pyramids become an Egyptian form? Like the pyramids of Giza or the Eiffel Tower, I would argue that the Citadel of Assembly, as it's often called, may someday be the most quintessential of its country as well. And this brings me to globalization, or the current phase in the relationship between the dominant and the dominated. The dominated are still with us. Indeed, the considerable migration from the former colonies to the lands of the former colonizers and the infiltration of ethnic subcultures into mainstream first world Western societies, Europe and North America, cannot be dismissed. In fact, this phenomena has often been the cause of many social conflicts, as these local subcultures often resort to ethnic, racial, or religious allegiances to defend their identity from being swallowed by the dominant majority culture. And in fact, you can see quite a lot of the events that occurred in Europe over the past year as an indication of that. But there's actually much more here, as Benjamin Barber points out in his appropriately and now almost more than a decade-old book, Jihad versus Macworld. Many nations in this new global order want it all, despite the obvious contradiction. Such nations want the veil and the rule of religion, but they also want the World Wide Web, Pepsi-Cola, and tremendous open internet access. Tim Mitchell, on the other hand, a good friend and an amazing political scientist at Columbia, argued that jihad is not antithetical to the development of Macworld, and that Macworld in reality is what he calls Mac Jihad, a necessary combination of a variety of social logics and forces that operate in the world today. Thus, third world countries evolved their own local appropriations of many first world practices. When there was a major boycott of Coca-Cola, Mecca-Cola suddenly appeared on the scene. We have to remember also that national identity is always in a process of transformation and flux. While the often contradictory forces of globalization are playing havoc with traditional loyalties and values and challenging the older ideologies and practices, I believe we are still a long way from having a so-called world culture. Regarding the relationship of architecture and culture, I have suggested elsewhere that in all of us as individuals and as communities, and possibly even as nations, there are two conflicting sentiments. In the first, we, as individuals, communities, and nations, and hence our architects, resort to culture and tradition out of fear of change, a change that in and of itself may be totally inevitable. Protectionism against the unknown, however, can turn into fundamentalism if unchecked. The second sentiment, characterized by interest, by often even tremendous interest, in the culture of the mysterious other, emerges from a totally different feeling, the desire to have the choice to merge with the other and to share in a wider or a different collective consciousness. Now, these two sentiments, in my opinion, both very legitimate, one cannot deny it to human beings or to communities, happen in the context of countries in the Gulf very often. And sometimes they happen either alternatively or simultaneously. And I think this, to a great extent, actually accounts at times for design strategies that may appear fundamentally confused, or where you're trying to marry things that do not belong together whatsoever. For those of us who are interested in the study of culture and architecture in the global era, there is a lesson here, I think. We must recognize, understand, and accept that even with the Disneyfication of everything, the world demonstrates a movement towards cultural differentiation and not necessarily homogenization, where each individual increasingly belongs to many cultures and where people have multiple cultural identities. It is something that we cannot actually deny them. I think 9/11 was a very good and strong reminder of that. It came out, or it happened, just at the time that people like Francis Fukuyama were writing The End of History and advocating the supposed triumph of liberal democracy. Well, it did not work. It was a reminder that identity, and even the attacks on identity, still mattered quite a bit. In this sense, identity is always under construction and in constant evolution. However, as the nations of the new globalized world order become more conscious of their religious, ethnic, and racial roots, and as they even problematize their colonial history or history of dominance, they are likely to seek forms and norms that represent these sub-identities, even if these send confused messages to the global audience that will ultimately still experience it through cyberspace, through the space of the internet. Now, time will tell what this will mean to the architecture of the 21st century. Because in the end, it is only in context that we can truly understand our own reality. Thank you.